Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd. Welcome, everybody, to the very first episode of The Primary Nerd.
And what is the purpose of the primary nerd?
Gee, I'm so glad you asked me that. No, but for real, though, I have a very fancy typed sheet of paper because I was thinking about this when you're putting together a podcast. What is it that you want to achieve? What is your ultimate purpose? So for us, or for me rather, the purpose of this is going to be to discuss the experiences and observation of historical persons through the lens of first-hand accounts, i.e. primary sources. While contextualization will be provided, our intent is not to prove or disprove an account, it is to listen to the human voices that witnessed what we refer to as history.
Because after all, history is about human life, about the human experience, yes.
Well, and I know, and again, I can't help but type this way, but, to break this down and make it not sound quite so scary, is that really what we're going to be looking at are letters, memoirs, maybe not even anything so formal that as to be published. Really anything can be a primary source, a first-hand account. So if you talk about in modern society, 9/11, where were you when 9/11 happened? What did you first hear? Were you writing a grocery list and you stop mid-thing and then you're starting to write down information as it's coming off the news? That's a primary source. It doesn't mean you're anywhere near the disaster, but it's connected to it. Mm-hmm. And so wanting to talk about people and how they lived, and they're not always going to have all of the information. It's not always going to be comprehensive because it's just not the nature of the beast.
Right. It's what they experience.
Exactly.
And they're sharing that with us. So what are going to be our guiding principles as we go through this endeavor?
So the first one for me is clear citation and the crediting of sources. This is so incredibly important. So we're going to be detailing our sources on the website, which is theprimarynerd.com. I'm also going to verbally credit sources as appropriate during each episode. So going from one memoir to another, I will, of course, be talking about who we're talking about. I'm not going to give you like a full bibliography. That would be way too heavy. But if you have any questions about where I have obtained a piece of information, please feel free to contact us at theprimarynerd@gmail.com.
It's the Primary Nerd Podcast at gmail.com.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay. What about the second guiding principle?
The analyzation of material. Interesting. So it looks like here a key aspect of each episode will be the reading of excerpts from the primary source material, thus providing an immersive experience of the historic event. However, this is not an audiobook series posing as a podcast. Mm-hmm. We will also be analyzing the material to delve into deeper issues, address unresolved questions, and generally explore the time period in a boots-on-the-ground approach.
Yes. So this is going to be where if you were to just simply read a primary source without the contextualization, you're going to miss a lot because they're not exactly explaining. So a really good example of this is if you ever read Les Mis by Victor Hugo. I was reading this book, and it was one giant inside joke, if you will, and I did not understand the punchline. He's referencing all of these people and all of these things, but he's not explaining why this makes sense with this. And because I didn't live in that time period, I have no idea what he's talking about.
How would you know?
No. So reading these sources, we are going to do our best not to overlay them with modern attitudes or preferences. I don't know. We're not going to overlay modernity onto it, but we do want to put it within its appropriate context so that we can actually glean decent information out of it and usable information.
Yeah, because what happened to them was a whole different time and place than where we're living in today. So.
And this goes right into number 3, which is respect. As stated in our purpose, the intent of the podcast is not to prove or disprove a primary source account. Now, that doesn't mean that we aren't going to compare and contrast. I think that also is kind of natural. If you've got two people that were allegedly in the court of Louis XVI and they're saying two radically different things, we need to talk about, wait a second, how could these two people have come to such radically different conclusions? Mm-hmm. So there will be some of that, but the point is not to point at an author and be like, liar. It is our view that there is value to be derived in each source, regardless of our personal feelings about the writer's point of view or attitude. Therefore, we feel it is of utmost importance that any discussion remain respectful to the author as a historical voice.
I agree. I've been reading a book on the princes that disappeared. I can't remember their names right now.
Princess in the Tower?
The Prince in the Tower,
Yeah.
yes. And the author states clearly that he's taking a lot of different people's information. Some was based on political, some was based on monetary, some was based on not wanting their head chopped off by the king. I mean, they had all different reasons to write about it. So I was like, wow, I didn't realize that, there'd be a lot of different things to drive people to capture history in certain ways. So,
most definitely.
It's not my, I'm not going to judge them. They wrote it for the reasons that they did, and it just kind of looking at them all has a different perspective on the circumstances.
Well, it's multifaceted.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I'm very excited about, because as I was looking up primary sources, there's the ones that make sense, that you're looking at Jefferson and Adams and George Washington. But then there's also, I'm very excited, I found a memoir of somebody who was in the Royalist camp during the Revolutionary War. So he was not a founding father. He was not a, yay, new America colonist. He was really sad that America gained its independence, and he was fiercely loyal to the king. And there's a part of me that it was like, oh man, like it feels almost a little traitorous to the country. But I'm like, no, but we should listen to his voice.
Sure.
We should see what he had to say, and maybe he has insight that we can, even if you walk away with just a better understanding, it doesn't mean you have to agree with them. You just are like, wow, I never thought of that from that perspective before.
Yeah, that was his life. It was his perspective, and there's things you can learn from everybody.
Frankly, he has the right to say it.
Sure.
Go ahead, Ted.
No, I was just saying it's very important to have guiding principles. I really appreciate that because if we adhere to these, it's going to be consistent. We will look at primary sources in history in a consistent manner.
Exactly.
And not go off down the rabbit trail of assumption and
and
those
it's not
type of
about
things.
us.
No, it isn't. No, it isn't. So when it comes to that, is there any disclaimers?
Yes. So there's a couple of disclaimers. Excuse me. So I put out in here, our research and our discussions are by no means a definitive or comprehensive overview of the primary source material as it relates to the time period in question. Again, because they're primary sources, they could be in a grandma's attic, they could be in a antique shop, they could be, and a really wonderful example of this is actually the Titanic. So when Father Brown, when he got a ticket on the Titanic, he left out of Southampton, they go over to Cherbourg, France, they pick up passengers, they go over to Queenstown, Ireland, and he disembarks. He also leaves with the only photos that we have of the Titanic.
Oh, wow.
Because he didn't go across the Atlantic. He didn't go down with the ship. So he has in his trunk that his grandchildren found all of these photos of the Titanic that came about 50, 100 years later. So you can never have a fully comprehensive view of primary source material. It's really not possible, especially as we get further forward in history.
Yeah.
Now, going backwards in history, there's only so many scraps of 1530s paper you're going to find that still exists. And we would have, protected it. It's probably in a library somewhere. But even so, I saw a newspaper article where they were ripping off wallpaper in like a Tudor-esque house, and they uncovered an entire original Tudor wall painting.
Oh, wow.
And I want to say that was 2 years ago.
Wow.
So there's always more to learn.
Yeah, always. There's always something to learn. So then the methodology of looking at primary sources.
Well, let's back up. Let's talk about what we mean by primary source, because I'm assuming a lot that that everybody knows exactly what we're talking about. So a primary source, like we've already kind of mentioned, it's going to be a letter, a newspaper article, question mark. But again, that's another person that's repeating a person's words. So in a way, that one's a little squishy. It is a primary knowledge holder sharing that information that they have, is essentially what a primary source is.
Okay.
So then a secondary source would be the book in which that information is given. So like we have to go off of primary sources in a secondary source nowadays, again, for like the Tudor period, because there's nobody alive still. So it's not like you can have that person stand up and tell their tale. We have to, transcribe it, summarize it, and then pass it along. And then so the secondary source is informed by the author's own bias, opinions, and the way that they were raised. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just for those of us that are now here living in 2022, and Americans being more specific, we are used to living in, a certain lifespan. We are used to a certain way that life goes. You grow up, you go to school, you get a job, you have a family, whatever. That's not how other people lived. And so I think that we can take our own understanding of just simply quote how the world works and map it on to people, assuming it of them as well.
Right.
And so that's the danger of the secondary source.
Understood. So you sound passionate about history.
Gee, how could you tell?
What is your background? What is your passion and your background for history?
Gee, like he doesn't know. By the way, this is my dad.
Yes.
For anybody listening, I will refer to him as Dad. Y'all would want to call him Brian, because it'd be weird otherwise. So really, my background for history came really, really young. I've got books on my shelf that I had since I was probably 8 or 9 years old. I remember buying the Mary Bloody Mary book by Carolyn Meyer, and that just set me off, and that's Henry VIII's daughter, Catherine of Aragon's daughter. And so reading about her experience and having this whole wide world open up, and I just couldn't get enough. And then to know it was real, it was like, wait a second, is this real? Is that real? What can I find out? And so as soon as I would get on a topic that would excite me, I just had to know more. So even one of my favorite stories to tell people, and I said this when I was in college, and I did get into the master's program in history at California Polytechnic State University, and they do the, why are you here? Why are you studying history? I was like, well, I was 13 years old, and I had my wisdom teeth extracted, and I got to watch Titanic for the first time. And everyone, what? So I'm watching Titanic, and you're all hopped up on Vicodin or whatnot, and you're 13, and of course this had come out 6 years prior. Everybody and their mom's already seen it. I'm way behind the 8 ball. And watching the movie and seeing the story unfold, and I was like, this cannot be real. This could not have happened like this. And so I go to those big, colorful Macs. When we used to have computer labs, they were like, they're bigger than a bread box, and I just start looking up everything, the deck plans, the passenger lists, everything I could get my grubby little hands on, because I just had to know more. And that never really stopped. So I did have the opportunity to go to college. I was very blessed, but I also want to add a great big caveat, because I was hesitant whether or not to bring that up. And I do not think that you need to have any sort of a degree. I think what you need to have is a passion, a desire to know more, and the willingness to push to get an answer. I think that
I agree.
That is going to be just as beneficial. But I do, talking about biases, that is one of mine, is that I did have the opportunity to go to college. So I do have a tendency to look through things with that lens, just to being in the spirit of transparency. What about you, Dad?
Well, I did not go to college. I've learned, experience of life has taught me many, many things in my life, and history just happens to be something that I'm very passionate and interested in. In fact, when we go on vacation, I really prefer going places where there's historical, whether like here on the East Coast, Revolutionary War, Civil War, just so much history, the colonies.
The architecture,
all the early wars, the French and Indian wars, and all the political alliances that were made in so many different ways as this country formed. It's fascinating to me. So
it's nothing that can really be contained and adequately expressed in a book.
No, it can't be. There's too much information.
Oh, yeah.
There's just too many things to learn that there's no way that any one book can cover. So
agreed.
As I've gotten older, I've just really become more. I enjoy history. I enjoy learning, and I think you can learn something new every day. So that's my intent, is to keep learning, and whether it's something I learned for work or whether I learn history or whatever the case may be, got to keep learning.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So there, going along with guiding principles and is this idea that I did want to put together kind of a methodology, is when I approach a document, what am I looking for? Because it is interesting when you go onto, and Google Play is a wonderful resource. If you go onto Google Play and then you search for a book and then you do the drop down to free, you're going to notice a ton of things that are usually in black and white. The typeface is kind of funny, but a lot of those are historical documents. So when I'm scanning through, what are the ones that make my bells go ding, ding, ding? There's a good one. This is what I want. So one of my first questions is, who is the author? Are they in a position where their observations that are written in this document are of historical value? Now, I want to be really clear here. Sorry. I am not asking if the writer is telling the truth. I am not asking if the writer's observations are interesting. And I am not asking if the writer is, quote, important enough, whether in terms of title or wealth, where their observations should be assigned greater weight. Because I think there is a tendency to, on the one hand, you want someone that has access. So if we're looking at the European courts, I'm more likely to I'm more likely to pick up, oh, a lady in waiting did this, a valet, a groom, somebody of the groom, because they have access. They're within the kind of the more private sphere. They're going to be able to speak to these things. But just because somebody has the name Duke in front of their name does not mean that they know anything more about this topic than somebody else. If they're in the north of England and we're talking about London, Duke of Northumberland, let's do Duke of Norfolk. He has no idea. He can't speak to this. So you need to look at who is the person and are they in a position where what they are saying could actually be true.
Yeah, that makes sense. It makes sense. Somebody who's there, somebody who has information, they actually saw it, experienced it, can speak to it, rather than somebody who's hearing it secondhand.
Right.
So
I said this is asking, did the writer personally witness the event in question? Does the writer have knowledge, expertise, or access to privileged information which allows them to testify on the topic both confidently and accurately? So one of the interesting ones that I ran across is, on the one hand, so McCluskey wrote a book, The Anatomy of the Titanic. And on the one hand, you look at it, this seems very steadily a secondary source. You're flipping through and you've got all these deck manifests and he's talking about how the Titanic was built, etc. And then you look at who McCluskey is, and he is a 5th generation shipbuilder, where all those previous generations worked at Harland and Wolff, which is the shipbuilding company that created Titanic. So then you're like, oh, wait, what? So he's in this interesting boat where you're like, he's so a secondary source. This was written in the 1970s. Obviously, he wasn't on the Titanic, but he was in a family that this was part of their legacy. So they would have been talking about it at the table. And he works at Harland and Wolff, like all those before him, and he works in a position where he has access to the archives to preserve them, but then also to promote the company. So he has access to privileged information where some of the stuff that he says, for me, it kind of walks that line where I'm like, could you kind of be considered a primary source? Like, question mark.
Right.
So I guess that's another thing is none of this is cut and dry. There's no multiple choice. Is this or is this not a primary source?
Right. Well, but it's your intent is to find trying to find information that helps glean information about the historical events that have occurred, and to learn more. And some of the things you've shared with me, there's some interesting things that have got me thinking differently about some of the events that I've heard of in my life. That some of the things you've shared, it's like, wow, unless you had found a primary source, you shared that with me, and it got me thinking, wow, that's something I didn't know about. So. Yeah. No, it's just about exploring this life that we all live together, this shared experience of life, and trying to understand what people went through. And
when history does become kind of a game of telephone, and things get warped or they get overstated or understated, or it wasn't good enough to. It ended up on the cutting room floor, But it interests me, but it maybe doesn't interest somebody else. So then the other things I had said, so who is the author? Are they in a position where their observations are of historical value? Why did this author write this account? Was it at somebody's behest? Because, especially as you move backwards in time, with the Tudors, etc., you've got ambassadors. The ambassador's purpose is to let their king know what's going on in this other court. So they are going to be focusing on certain things that the king finds important. If there is a political enemy, they are not going to be looking favorably on that political enemy. They're just not.
So it could be a little biased on there.
Totally. Oh, totally. So, if they're writing about how King Henry is bad, fat, and smells horrible, King Francis is the best. It's like, yeah, except for he's absolutely employed by King Francis.
Right.
Let's talk about that. And then also, when was this account published and how long after the event? Yeah. You are going to be blown away by the amount of things on Google Play or wherever that it'll say memoirs of Anne Boleyn, memoirs of Marie Antoinette. And then you look at the date and you're like, except for that was like 150 years later. Wow. And it isn't like they have their letters that were then published later. It is just a person. And this is something that people had a tendency to do. We would think of it more like a history of Anne Boleyn, a history of Marie Antoinette. But they call them memoirs of. So you've got to be really careful to actually look and be like, but really? Like, where did this... 1848 Fleet Street, London. No. That's not right.
Very well. I am so glad that we have finally gotten to the point where we have this kickoff episode of going through our purpose, guiding principles, goals, disclaimers, methodology, all this good stuff. But it's important. It's important that we have structure. It's important that we have principles and things that keep us in line as we look at history and go through this. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So you've worked hard on this. I'm looking forward to what we're going to be discussing in the episodes to come.
I've got some really fun stuff.
Oh,
I've got
cool.
stuff that I'm having to go, okay, don't get carried away. It's going to be all right. So no, I am thrilled. This has been this right here is kind of a lifelong dream for me, was that when I went into history, it was with the intent to teach, and life unfortunately just didn't go that way. So, but my thing was always, I had such a passion for it. I've been up in front of a classroom before, like when I was a grad student, and it was just wonderful. It was so great to be able to actually connect with them and to see that light of kind of recognition and like that, oh, really? Like that kind of that acquisitive head tilt, just, it gets me so excited. So the idea of being able to take all of this knowledge and have it, share it with others. And if my goal is not to come in and be like, I know everything about this. I definitely don't. Trust me, I don't. But if I could get somebody to go, you know what? I should get a book on this. That is going to tickle me to death. Oh,
very cool. Well, I tell you, you know far more about history. I know a very, very thin overview of history. There not really a lot of depth. And so the more I'm learning about depth in history is really surprising me, because there's a lot of things I'm learning that I never heard.
I think that the more that you really learn about history and the deeper you go, the more you realize how much more there is to learn.
Oh, yes.
So that's where I am, is I'm like, no. No, I am no expert. I just love to read. So that is where I am. And if there's ever anything that we're discussing and you guys find a different source or a different book or a different argument that you're like, well, what about this? This totally flies in the face of that. Bring it my way. That's great. Let me know, because there's only so many books I can afford. So let me know.
Reach out to us at the Primary Nerd Podcast at gmail.com, or we are at the primarynerd.com.
Which is where we're going to be listing all of our sources, because that is so important to me.
Yes.
So we are going to be continually updating that website, and I have a tendency to make, what's the word I'm looking for? Charts. I like to make a visual aid because I'm a very visual learner. And so when I'm putting something together and it's just not quite clicking in sentence form, I'll make a table or a flow chart or something. So anything that I make, I will make sure to put it up on the website. I will also cite where that information came from, so we are all above board. We want to give credit where credit is due, because people worked really, really hard on these books.
No, it is. History is about all of us.
Yes,
that's for you couldn't have it in a vacuum.
No, that'd be weird.
That would be weird.
Very weird.
So with that, we're going to have to work on our sign off, I guess. Is that we're going to have
what do we do for a sign off?
Well, I think possibly we'll just do like we did maybe in the beginning. You'll say,
okay. Well, I'm Courtney.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the Primary Nerd.
All right. Very good. Well done.